It is my honor to introduce Ian McCabe today, Dr. McCabe. You know, he was really just so incredibly helpful and inspirational for me while I was writing a book. It's an honor to introduce him today. And something that just always strikes me about the Jungian community and just the professional community, just how kind they are. Just it's amazing their kindness, and Ian's kindness today and preparing this lesson or this seminar, and then coming and sharing with us. Like, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to this. So Ian is a recently trained psychedelic assisted therapist. The title of the talk could be misleading. It's important to point out that he is not promoting LSD or psychedelics as a cure for alcoholism. I just want to emphasize that right up front. As a researcher, Ian was fortunate to discover Bill's second letter to Carl Jung, that sort of in the 12-step side of the equation has always sort of been, secret. And so what Ian is doing is, that there's a recognition that this historical information doesn't need to be suppressed, that however it does need to be handled with care, with circumspection. It's an interesting perspective to look at Bill's understanding of LSD in treating these really kind of low bottom newcomers. That's what we're going to be looking at today, is just to kind of look at Bill's support for LSD as perhaps something of an initiator to help the newcomers to move into sobriety. I think this is a really interesting topic. It's very timely, right? This stuff is all over the place. I see it on my own social media, how with ayahuasca and LSD and mushrooms, everything. Everyone's trying to promote this as this, like, get spiritual kind of quick sort of thing. But so this is an interesting conversation, and I've had the privilege of seeing the talk that Ian's going to give, and it just looks really interesting. I'm very, very excited. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ian now. So take it away.
Cody, thank you very much indeed for the introduction. And again, Cody, your own book brought up some new information about Carl Jung. We might imagine that everything has been known about Carl Jung, but your own book, with him going with the eccentric Jamie, for professor from Berkeley University, to South America, it was very revelatory to me, and I'm sure there's some interest there in psychedelics as well. So thank you for that. I'd like to welcome all of you, 262 people. It's the most people I've ever spoken to. The maximum I've done before is 100. So my name's Ian McCabe, and as Cody mentioned, I've recently trained as a psychedelic assisted psychotherapist, which is very strange because 30 years ago, I was on a program at California Institute of Integral Studies, which is college, which is quite way out there. And a guy came up to me and he said, would you like to join our group, which is dealing with psychedelic emergencies, and Stan Groff is leading it. And I said, tell me more about it. He said, oh, it's to do with ayahuasca. And I said, stay away from me. Go, you're the devil. Go away, go away, go away, go away. And wouldn't have anything to do with them. But subsequently, fast forward 25 years, a close member of my family who was having great trouble with his own family went on an ayahuasca trip in Holland under the guidance of a weekend. I call it a trip, but a weekend retreat. And his life changed. His life changed. So I remembered back to 30 years ago when the guy was inviting me to join the group in the California Institute of Integral Studies in relation to ayahuasca. And he said when he was in Brazil, the people there, when they talked about ayahuasca, they would touch their heart and they would say, oh, ayahuasca. And that was the reverence they had for it. So today, when I look at my relative, I go, ayahuasca, it has reformed someone's life incredibly, where AA wasn't working for them. Well, they wouldn't go to AA, straightforward as that. So how I got involved in this, I didn't want to become what I call the messenger for LSD. Believe me, I was doing a thesis at the Jung Institute, a straightforward thesis, Carl Jung and his relationship with Bill Wilson, dating from Bill Wilson's first letter to him in thanking him for putting Roland Hazard on the right road. And I thought it'd be a fairly simple, straightforward thing. And I went over to the headquarters of AA in Riverside, New York, and I was going through the research papers, and everything was quite smooth and nice. And suddenly I came across a letter from Carl Jung's secretary around about 1963, April, saying, "Thank you for your letter." And I thought, hold on, no, his earlier letter was sometime before that, maybe a couple of years before that. Maybe she got the date wrong. And I wondered, how would she be replying to a letter and get the date wrong? So I went up to the archivist and I said, look at this. This is a reply to a letter, and it's not the original famous letter we all know about. Could there be another letter? And she looked at me and she said, yes, there is another letter. And I said, great, could I please have a look at it? And she said, wait for a moment and I'll see. We won't have it today, but maybe come back tomorrow. So I came in the next day and I was met by a trustee from AA, big tall fella, very overpowering, who sat down beside me in the research and said, well, what's your research on? And I said, it's on Carl Jung and AA. And he seemed very interested. And I was interested in getting this second letter. So the archivist came back and said, I'm sorry, we can't give you the second letter. And I said, oh, okay. So then I realized that across upstate New York is Bedford, where Bill Wilson's home is, Stepping Stones, and they have archives there, which are generally a duplicate of the archives in Riverside headquarters. So I went there and casually asked the archivist, I said, oh, there's a second letter dated 1963, and I wonder if I could have a look at this, please. She said, sure. And off she went down into the basement for about 10 minutes, and she came back holding the letter. And I thought, oh, this is a little golden nugget. As a researcher, occasionally you get golden nuggets that nobody else has found. And so I said, great. So I stretched out my hand and she said, no, oh, I'll let you have page 1, page 2, but you can't have the last 2 pages. And I said, well, why not? And she said, oh, it's to do with medical matters. I went, okay, okay, okay. So I realized I really wasn't going to get anywhere, this letter, but it now intrigued me. This letter existed and I wasn't being given a look at it. So I then decided that it must have been received by Carl Jung. So therefore, it must be in Switzerland somewhere. So I wrote to the archivist in Switzerland, and they said, if you get the permission of the family of Carl Jung, then we will let you have a look at the letter. And I go, oh, yeah, that's easy. They refuse everything because they don't want Carl Jung to be seen as anyway eccentric. So I was very interested in his Buddhist interests, and I didn't get anywhere with that. But then I was fortunate enough to have a supervisor who was a trustee of the Carl Jung archives. And I approached him, and he got me permission to get into the archives to get the letter from the university archives where it was being stored and held. And so I got the letter. Now, what should I do with it? I wanted to be very, very responsible. So when my thesis was accepted, the thesis supervisor was the same guy who's a trustee, offered to publish the thesis as a book because he was very interested in the letter and the publicity it might generate. And I was a bit concerned just as a responsible person, not to handle something that was dynamite without getting some guidance. So I spoke to several people, and what I did eventually was I put it in my book, but you won't find it because I put the letter, the 2 pages of the letter in the appendix. So only if someone had read the book and sorted through the appendix and got to it, then they would see it in the bare way it was presented. So I wasn't going to title the book Bill Wilson Takes LSD or Bill Wilson and LSD, because it might damage somebody coming into the program who thinks, oh, it's about them taking psychedelic drugs. No, no, no. I just didn't want to take that responsibility. So my book was just called Carl Jung and Alcoholics Anonymous. And so rather than dramatize it or publicize it or get it into the tabloids, I was very, very careful, very conservative. I'm not normally conservative, but this time I am. And the question I did pose to the AA archivists is, they say, we're only as sick as our secrets. And what's wrong with this information? And in a way, part of it was already published very quietly in the book Pass It On, Bill Wilson and the AA Message, but it's not the full extent of the letter. Some of you have taken the trouble to request it, over 20 of you, and hopefully you will see that it is quite detailed and quite phenomenal. Essentially, it's saying Bill was concerned that the people coming into AA, as we know, leave quite quickly after 1 or 2 meetings, the majority. He was saying there was a 5 to 10% retention rate. There's been no statistics on that because AA, as far as I know, doesn't do statistics, but he was talking with 2 psychiatrists from Canada who were claiming a 50% rate amongst alcoholics who were also psychotic. And that was phenomenal. And he, being an entrepreneur, if you like, an investigator, took it upon himself to try the LSD to find out what it would do for him and whether it would be of help to the still suffering alcoholic. To me, he was heroic in doing this. And of course, he was somewhat sidelined by the trustees, which is to be expected. But today, psychedelics are coming into the forefront. There's applications for approval from the Federal Drugs Administration, and psychiatrists are able already to prescribe ketamine. And the overall influence of any of these psychedelic drugs is to suppress the ego, suppresses the ego and allows what Jungians would call the real self, the true self, to emerge, however briefly. And the true self offers guidance as to sobriety, how to do the right thing. So I'll begin my talk, and if I'm going on too long, somebody can raise their finger, maybe Cody. So let's see how this will work. Okay. So there was a famous book called We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World is Getting Worse. Okay, so what I'll be talking about is Bill Wilson's secret letter. Carl Jung advocating LSD for recalcitrant alcoholics, and also Jung's attitude to psychedelics. He was very conservative, and he didn't like them at all. He thought that the same experiences could be generated by certain methods that he encouraged. It could be through dream analysis, through artwork, and talk therapy. So essentially now people who are being trained, it's not that a person takes LSD as some of us did when we were mad 18-year-olds or 20-year-olds. No, it's done under medical supervision by trained therapists with a psychiatrist leading it. And it takes 2 or 3 sessions. And then afterwards, there's integration, etc. So it's not just dropping a bit of acid and saying, oh, I'm going to join AA. Not like that at all. It's much more to do with a medical intervention, which interestingly, as was spoken about earlier, AA members are not supposed to advise on this. Okay, so what we have is the term psychedelics was coined by Humphrey Osmond in 1957, and he said it was anything that had the capability of manifesting and revealing unconscious properties of the mind, basically. And Osmond co-authored this book about the successful use of LSD in the 50s and 60s with alcoholics. Osmond and his colleague, Abraham Hoffer, told Bill Wilson about their success in treating alcoholics with LSD. And at first, Bill Wilson was unthrilled to hear about this success, in the same way as when people approached me about ayahuasca 30 years ago at the university in California. I didn't want to know. So Bill wasn't into it, but he listened to them. Now, interestingly, while preparing this lecture, I asked the Psychological Association, American Psychological Association, why the word psychedelic wasn't in their online dictionary, and they said, no, psychedelics is not in the dictionary of psychology. Almost to exclude it, and from a philosophical point of view, if a word doesn't exist, then the actual process doesn't exist. It's a philosophy to say that, for example, Queen Victoria, there was no word for lesbians in Queen Victoria's time, and therefore there was no prosecutions against lesbians as there was against gay men, because there was no word for it, and therefore it didn't exist, and that suited the likes of Queen Victoria. Bill Wilson and LSD. So Bill was disappointed by the numbers who came through the doors of AA and failed to stay. We've all experienced this. People come in, we're full of enthusiasm, we're very welcoming, friendly, then we don't see them again. He was looking for a way to introduce alcoholics who were anti-religion or spiritual skeptics to a spiritual experience. So in the mid-50s, Bill Wilson promoted the use of LSD to help alcoholics who were having difficulty accepting the spiritual aspect of the program. I always find this very funny. A friend of mine who says he was sleeping in a skip. He was sleeping in a skip. And the rubbish was being thrown in on top of him. Eventually, they brought him into a hospital. They brought him into a hospital. And after 3 days, he started complaining about the state of the sheets, that they weren't ironed sufficiently. This is like people who've had devastating lives, and they come into AA and they go, "Oh, there's a God there in one of the steps. Oh, jeez, I'll give up on all of this. I don't want to know," and go back and sleep in their skip. But anyway, so Wilson's main effort outside AA in the final 15 years of his life were attempts to remove the mental or psychological and physical obstacles that impeded some persons from opening to the spiritual. Of course, it's strange. It often reminds me of being very strange, even in Ireland, very Catholic country. I could go into a pub and I could find 10 atheists. But outside of that, everybody was in the church and totally. But in the pub, there were so many atheists. And I wondered if there was a connection with the alcohol fueling the ego to think we are the gods. Anyways, so in 58, Wilson wrote to the Reverend Samuel, let me get his name up for a moment, Shoemaker, of course. And he explained that LSD seems to be the result of sharply reducing the forces of the ego, and that ego reduction makes the influx of God's grace possible. So this ego edging God out makes some sense. That for a short period of time, the ego that is against the spiritual, the God, or the cure, or whatever, is suppressed, and the true self emerges. And this is how Bill Wilson said that LSD worked. And I think psychologically, it was a very, very good explanation. And indeed, it was from his own experience of using LSD under medical supervision and the successive research by psychiatrists Osmond and Hoffer in Canada that Bill Wilson wrote his second letter to Carl Jung in March 1961, the third page of which reads, "Some of my friends and I have taken the material frequently and with much benefit. Once in the experience, there's a great broadening and deepening and heightening of consciousness, which bears little or no relation to hallucination. More reality is seen and felt, not less. We have seen the whole range of valid spiritual experience precipitated in this manner. On my first trial several years ago, my original spontaneous spiritual experience of 25 years before was reenacted in wonderful splendor and conviction." Now, we all know about Bill's experience in Towns Hospital, where he got down on his knees and he said, if there be a God, let him or show themselves. And then the curtains brushed open and the wind came in. But now he's saying that this experience of LSD sort of reenacted this wonderful, wonderful experience. So the fact that he was taking belladonna amongst a range of other drugs while he was in Towns Hospital would raise the question, was his white, to call it the white experience, provoked by a hallucinogenic? To me, it doesn't really matter. It came from within himself, and it gave him the courage to go out and promote the AA program from Dr. Towns Hospital. So he carries on and says, "My depression deepened unbearably, and finally it seemed to me as though I was at the bottom of the pit. All at once I found myself crying out, 'If there is a God, let him show himself. I'm ready to do anything, anything.' Suddenly the room lit up with a great white light." They call it, I believe, the white light experience. "I was caught up into an ecstasy which there are no words to describe. It seemed to me in the mind's eye that I was on a mountain and that a wind, not of air, but of spirit, was blowing. And then it burst upon me that I was a free man. Slowly the ecstasy subsided. I was in another world, a new world of consciousness. All about me and through me, there was a wonderful feeling of presence. And I thought to myself, so this is the God of the preachers." As perhaps you know, this is in his letter to Carl Jung. Many psychiatrists still cling to the conviction that these LSD experiences are always schizophrenia and rather dangerous, yet hard evidence has been accumulating that this is seldom the case. Of course, these LSD manifestations are deeply shocking to many theologians and even psychiatrists, yet a total of 50,000 administrations in the US and Canada during the past 7 or 8 years has resulted in virtually no harm and certainly large benefits to many. He continues to write, "Because of a close connection with two physicians, Doctors Abraham Hoffer and Humphrey Osmond, I have access to case material covering thousands of administrations of LSD. Over the past 3 years, 150 cases have been so treated by my Canadian friends, Hoffer and Osmond. As of this writing, 75 are remaining perfectly sober in the outside world. This scarcely squares with the widespread view that LSD is dangerous and hallucinatory." So Hoffer and Osmond had a hospital, psychiatric hospital in Canada in a place called Saskatchewan. I can never pronounce it, Saskatchewan. You can help me with it afterwards. And they were giving LSD to patients who were schizophrenic, and they found by accident, as many inventions happened, by accident, that schizophrenics who were also alcoholics would cease their craving for alcohol. So then they started giving it to hardcore psychotics who were also alcoholic, and found that they were, again, reducing their compulsion to drink. So he ends his letter saying, and this is just an extract of it. If anybody wants the full letter, I will send it to you. And already 20 people have asked for it, but it's in an article that was published last year. And the relevant 2 pages are fully there for you to see. But he ends his letter saying, I've entered these observations for your interest and, if agreeable, for your comment. But please be assured that it will be perfectly understood if your time, inclination, or health should not permit you to reply. Mainly, I am writing in thanks for your recent message and again to record the deep gratitude of our AA fellowship for your single contributions to its welfare over the years. You will remember that Carl Jung advised the American businessman Roland Hazard that he would get some sort of spiritual connection, and Roland joined the Oxford group, and from that he got his friend Ebby Thatcher into the Oxford group, and in turn Ebby Thatcher got his friend Bill Wilson to come along to the Oxford group, where Bill gained sobriety and then established Alcoholics Anonymous. So in 1961, May the 5th, 1961, Anelia Yaffe, Jungian analyst and Jung's secretary, replied to Bill Wilson, Carl Jung read your letter of March 20th. He had in his mind to answer you, but that he fell ill and the doctor ordered complete rest. Feeling better, he left for a long vacation and therefore the mail is not done. Maybe he will write you at a later time. Yaffe added as postscript, he said that he is very much interested in the work of Alcoholics Anonymous. Carl Jung was an introvert. He didn't like groups at all. He saw the Nuremberg rallies, how groups could take over the mentality of all the members and reduce them to the lowest common denominator. But yet, with Alcoholics Anonymous, he was so impressed by the work that was being carried on. And one of his proteges met him and told him about it and introduced Bill Wilson's writings to him and introduced the writings of Bill Wilson to Carl Jung and Carl Jung to Bill Wilson. And Carl Jung endorsed AA and gave complete instructions as to how it might be extended to other groups. And hence we have so many other groups connected with the 12-step program, particularly people with depression, eating, and obviously narcotics. But Carl Jung immediately saw how the 12-step program could be of great help. He died on the 6th of June, 61, without ever answering the letter. So really within a month or so, he died. So I'm asking now, what were Jung's views on psychedelics? There's some speculation that he was under the influence of psychedelics when he was writing his Red Book. One of the Jungian scholars, Sonu Shamdasani, revealed to Nancy Swift Ferlotti that there was strong evidence that Jung tried mescaline. Now, I haven't seen that evidence. I don't know what it is. I'm always a bit wary when people say there's strong evidence. I go, well, can I see it, please? But Carl Jung, when he's writing the Red Book, definitely went into altered states of consciousness. But you know, he was able to do that. So I'm saying that he used conventional Jungian methods of dream analysis, meditation, particularly active imagination, where he could imagine stuff that he had his special friend and he was talking to him, a bit like a 4-year-old child who would have a special friend and talk to them. So Jung's own extended period of altered consciousness, he was once asked, do you occasionally resort to stimulants of any kind? Alcohol, hashish, etc. And he answered, no, never. A new idea is intoxicating enough. Jung wrote, and it's as though he must have experienced something like LSD, because this to me would be someone who had experienced LSD. He wrote, I should hate the thought I had touched on the spear where the paint is made that colors the world. I mean, that is just so poetic that we see the rainbow and where did the colors come from? And he's saying that LSD would help him to get in touch with where the paint is made, where the light is created that makes shine the splendor of the dawn. And again, when to appreciate the dawn coming up, where's it come from? Who's painting it? The lines and shapes of all forms, the sound that fills the orbit, the thought that illuminates the darkness of the void. He says, I am profoundly mistrustful of the pure gifts of the gods. You pay very dearly for them. So what he's saying is that people who take LSD become godlike to a certain extent, or they get a taste of being God. But he says that of course it can be very, very dangerous, but unless it's done under guidance to come down and seen that there is a wonderful, brilliant, unbelievable world out there, and that's what LSD actually does for people. Now, in 54, Victor Francis, while a Dominican priest, wrote to Jung about his visit to Worcestershire Asylum to talk to staff and try to lend a hand with religious archetypal material which patients were producing under the LSD drug. Now, Worcestershire Asylum was a hospital prior to them using LSD. The person who was in charge used to have the teeth of the patients extracted so that theoretically they wouldn't bite the staff. But that meant that he could feed them bread and milk, mushy bread and milk. And he used the money that he was saving to buy wonderful works of art, totally corrupt, but it was taken over and a complete new regime allowed LSD to help the patients. So Jung replied at length to White, this was in 1954, and he's asked, is the drug LSD mescaline? It has indeed very curious effects. Look at Aldous Huxley, of which I know far too little. I don't know either what its psychotherapeutic value with neurotic or psychotic patients is. I only know there is no point in wishing to know more of the collective unconscious than one gets through dreams and intuition. So he was very, very rigid in his thinking that he had found the answer. So what I've described earlier on was that a pioneering psychiatrist, Ronald Sanderson, was a consultant at Worcestershire Asylum where Victor White worked. And Sanderson rejuvenated the hospital and it gained an internationally acclaimed reputation for treating patients with LSD. And Sanderson described himself as an analytical psychotherapist, which means a Jungian orientated psychotherapist. And he traveled to Zurich hoping to meet Jung. And Carl Muir, the director of the Jung Institute, warned him not to talk to Jung about his work with LSD, as Jung was greatly opposed to its use. According to Scott Hill, who's written a book on this confrontation with the unconscious, said Sanderson fairly believed that Jung's letter to White reflects Jung's ignorance of psychedelic enhanced therapy. Now, you would think, myself being trained as a Jungian analyst, and we hold Carl Jung in great respect, that we wouldn't question him. Yet Jungianism is quite open to questioning. However, let's look at someone who was interested and worked with Bill Wilson. Betty Grosvenor Eisner, a clinical psychologist, she wrote to Jung. She'd been with Bill Wilson when he first took LSD. And in her letter, she stated for her, LSD was almost a religious drug. But if you look to the right, you'll see unorthodox therapist asks return of license. She had her license taken away because she was doing some work with a patient that allowed the patient to re-experience some trauma while in a bath, and the patient drowned. It was dreadful, but it just shows that when there's something new around, the people who'll be attracted to it, may not always be the safest of people. So always be wary. So Carl Jung wrote to Miss Eisner, I don't feel happy about these things since you merely fall into such experiences without being able to integrate them. To have so-called religious visions of this kind has more to do with physiology, but nothing with religion. So now in psychedelic assisted therapy, it's very important that the therapist help the patient to integrate the experience of LSD. So if it is LSD, it can be MDMA, it can be ketamine, it can be ayahuasca, but to let them have the experience in a supervised room with earphones for nice music and a nice blankets to keep warm, and thereafter to talk to them, to integrate the experience, and then to have them come back a few days later to talk about it a bit more. So Carl Jung continues to say, religion is a way of life and a devotion and submission to certain superior facts, a state of mind which cannot be injected by a syringe or swallowed in the form of a pill. It is, to my mind, a helpful method to the barbarous peyote, but a regrettable regression for a cultivated individual, a dangerously simple errats and substitute for true religion. So he was really saying, he called peyote barbarous. He was saying that, you can't take a pill and instantly get religion. But John Rainey, in his thesis for the Jung Institute, considered Jung's stance to be totally without substance. Laney claimed that because the smoking of peyote is centered in a 12-hour ceremony called the prayer meeting, it is similar to the Catholic High Mass, and Jung had therefore vilified prayer itself, he continued. And when you think about the Catholic High Mass, the smoke, forget the name that it comes from, but perhaps it has got some similarity to that. So Jung was being criticized by one of his own students for his really ignorant and close-minded approach. So this student writes, a scientific approach would soon have discovered that these people do not use mescaline, syringes, or pills. It would have found them to be deeply religious, in no way barbarous, nor seeking of shortcuts. Rather, it would have found a pan-Indian religious development of at least a century's duration. So still today in America, there are still religions that are allowed to use psychedelics as part of their religious experiences. So where are we today? 2024, 2025 now. War on drugs. Okay, assistant to President Richard Nixon, John Ehrlichman, and I'll be finished now in 2 minutes. The Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. Anti-war were the hippies. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black people, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana, Tijuana, the Mexicans, and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Ehrlichman says, of course we did. Of course we did. It just sounds so cynical. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 made psychedelics were placed in the most restrictive category of drugs, Schedule 1. And Schedule 1 includes drugs not used medicinally, includes hallucinogenic drugs like LSD. Schedule 1 classification of psychedelics made them virtually impossible to study, to research clinically, and effectively ended any significant research into the medical value of psychedelics for more than 3 decades. So Jung was opposed to psychedelic use, yet a psychological theory shares similar concepts for healing and development, which recognize the importance of building a bridge between ordinary consciousness and non-ordinary states. So there are many, there's a book now, Psychedelics and Individuation by Jungian analysts, and they are all saying how beneficial the psychedelics are. Here's a wonderful quote from a guy called William Richards in his book, Sacred Knowledge. He said, claims are frequently made that some single psychedelic experiences are equivalent to several years of regular psychotherapeutic treatment. So someone goes into therapy twice a week for 7 years. Here's Bill Richards saying claims are made that one session is as good as 7 years. Now, he says, it would be easy to dismiss such words as irresponsible exaggeration, were not that some were spoken by people who were themselves professional therapists. So, according to Jungian analysts, really that it's to do with the setting and integration. So when psychedelics are being taken, the set has to be calm, and then the persons have got to be trained, and especially to make sure that there's no boundary breaches. And then afterwards, there is the integration. So it's arguable, for example, that one of the teachers on the California Institute of Integral Studies course, Phelps, that she would say the integrative model of treatment is more in common with Jungian orientation, because rather than an emphasis on symptomatology and its treatment, Jungians address remembering the disconnected part of ourselves. So today, the most popular psychedelics include psilocybin, that's magic mushrooms, lysergic acid, LSD, ayahuasca, and MDMA. And there are many similarities with the collective unconscious. I won't go into that too much, but Jungian analysis is very much disposed toward the results that psychedelics achieved. In other words, psychedelics will achieve what Jungian analysis is trying to also achieve. So is the use of psychedelics to induce a spiritual experience in alcoholics deserving of further research? That's the question I pose to you, and no doubt you will ask it of me tonight. British Psychological Society answered this by Professor David Nutt, who's a leading researcher from Imperial College, and he concluded, the failure of the scientific community, particularly neuroscientists, to protest the denial of research on hallucinogenics is one of the most disturbing failures of science leadership in the past century, and it must be rectified. So I will end on that, only to say that I think there are many millions of people with alcohol problems who've gone to an early grave, who haven't come into AA or have come in and left. And maybe if they'd had an opportunity to undergo a psychedelic treatment, they would still be alive today. That's my own personal opinion, but I'm not going to promote that. So any questions, please feel free. Thank you.
I just want to thank Ian, really appreciate this discussion.